We closed up last time with the Black Death and how terrible it was. And could something like that happen again? I say there's a chance that it could, because somehow or another the ability of disease germs to cause disease sometimes seems to keep a small step ahead of our ability to cure it. And we have new diseases coming on the scene that we never dreamed of before. So there could come a disease that will be resistant to every kind of antibiotic known. I'm not saying it will, but it's possible. And we could have another plague of sorts. I remember in 1960, I was reading Reader's Digest. I was 11 years old, and they talked about here for the next 40 years. The Reader's Digest was 40 years old, started in 1920. Then they told all the progress we'd made in the last 40 years, and then projected what would happen between 1960 and 2000. One thing they projected was that by to the year 2000, medicine will be more a matter of prevention than cure. We will have cures for all our diseases. And we will now be just concerned with preventing disease. Instead, what happened was a whole bunch of new diseases came on the scene, and the diseases that were already on the scene became resistant to our drugs. And the result is we still have problems with disease. And yes, we still have problems with plague. All right. Now, next topic is peasant rebellions. Essentially, something about these plagues, they carried off the upper classes as well as the lower. Like I said, the people left behind were the old maids, who we might today call welfare people. The old maids did not get carried away as much, but the wealthy people got carried away just as much as the poor, and a whole lot of nobles were weakened. Which one?
931.
931, okay. Well, you know, you're in luck. Do you have a scan toner? Okay. Anyway, yeah, you're in luck in that one of your classmates came and took it earlier, so that's why I have the sheet handy. All right. The peasant rebellions were destined, folk, and if you study more of European history, they were destined to last until about the year 1848. It was just one after another. They had one in Martin Luther's day in around the 1540s. They started with the Black Death, and they just kept on happening one after another. In France, they became brutal, and if you keep studying your history, you'll find that the most brutal of all the rebellions were the French. The French went through a period of time called the French Revolution, and the French Revolution was exceptionally brutal, to say the least. And it did not result in a democracy. France was to go through a revolution in 1830, another one in 1832, another one in 1848. Anyway, that's jumping ahead of the story a little bit. The point I want to make is these peasants did have some grievances and some gripes. The problem is, all right, you might have heard that Cuba had a leader named Batista, so they got rid of Batista, didn't like him, and they got Fidel Castro. You've got to catch my point, I hope. The Russians did not like the Tsar, so they got rid of the last Tsar, shot him and his family dead, and they got Lenin and Stalin and Khrushchev, one after another. Well, I could go on and on. Oh yeah, the Iranians did not like the Shah. The Shah was in power, and he was ousted a little bit before most of you were born. They got rid of the Shah and they got Ayatollah Khomeini. The Germans did not like the Kaisers. They got rid of the Kaiser and they got Adolf Hitler. Now I can name you two young men who decided they did not like living in their homes. So said, we don't like my dad laying down the rules. We don't like our mother telling us to clean up the room. I want to go somewhere where that I can be free. I know how I can get out of the house. I'm going to go join the Marines. And they found out after they got joined that the Marines corporals made their dads seem like a nice, easy, mild-mannered, quiet, soft-spoken man, and their mother was definitely a nice, easy-going, soft-spoken woman. compared to those Marine corporals. And oh yeah, did the Marines make them clean out their sink? Did the Marines make them wash their clothes and shine their shoes? And some of you might know the answer to that. Far more strict than their parents ever were. All right, hopefully you catch my drift. You rebel against authority, and what you're going to get is far worse authority. It happens time and time again. There have been very few revolutions in the history of mankind that have actually worked. One example might be the American Revolution. Here's what was so great about America. The American Revolution was simply where that the American people were telling the king to keep laws that were already on the books. They had no radical agenda, just, hey, the idea of taxation representation had been on the law books of England for some 400 years. Trial by jury, that had been on the books of England for some 700 years. They were just simply trying to tell the King of England, hey, keep the laws that we have always abode by. In defense of the King of England, though, I will say, to administer the same type of justice over here in the colonies that they had back in England. England, keep in mind, is just a small island, would have cost the king more than the king could afford. The best solution really was to give Americans their own parliament, give Americans their own courts, their own governors, which the king was not quite willing to do. But it just simply would have cost too much of the king's treasury for him to give the colonies what the rights the people of England had. But that was one of the few revolutions that worked. The Japanese had a revolution called the Meiji Restoration that worked somewhat. But these peasant rebellions were slowly, very, very slowly and gradually to break the power of the nobility. But it took some 500, 450, 500 years. Eventually the power of the nobility got broken. Eventually the peasants, most of these countries got to democracy. And then they went from democracy to socialism, or at least tried to. And speaking of socialism, I read something this morning about the socialism experiment in Venezuela. They can't even afford to have their own money printed up or minted. Venezuela is too poor to even mint its own coins or even print up its own paper. I mean, it's like they can't even, they don't have enough money to make money with. And other countries are not doing business with them because they're so poor they are slow at meeting their debts. They've been buying on credit and can't pay. And so other countries are simply stopping doing business with them, which is in turn going to make them poorer. If any of you can find an instance where socialism has actually worked over the long haul, I'd like to hear about it. All right, anyway, Europeans, now, in France in particular, the revolts became very brutal. In England, a peasant rebellion actually marched on London. Now, I want to say this about England. If you jump ahead of the story, when the revolutions occurred in the 1800s and the late 1700s in Europe, England did not have any. But at this time in the 1400s, England did have a revolution, and the rebels actually marched on the capital. And Richard II, the king at that time, promised the rebels concessions if they just dispersed. So they all went home, and then Richard had them punished anyway, broke his promise, punished them anyway. But in spite of the turmoil, wages went up. So a bunch of kings tried to limit the rising wages, thinking, hey, we don't want these poor people to become as rich as we are. They also regulated prices. And again, well, I'm old enough to remember we had a president who tried to regulate wages and prices once. His name was Richard Milhouse Nixon. We found out that wages and prices are a lot of times one and the same. If you freeze wages, prices will be frozen also. If you freeze prices, wages will be frozen also. That's the point I'm trying to make. Nevertheless, more and more serfs were able to buy their freedom. Towns sprang up. With more and more serfs being freed, the nobility had a harder and harder time finding laborers. And to do that, they would offer the laborers, but they had to treat their workers better for one. And they had to pay them more for another. All right, which takes us up to the 100 Years' War. I've got two more stories to tell folk, then I'll finish. All right, essentially, 100 Years' War got started when Philip the Fair, he had 3 sons. Now, you may remember I told you the story about the Knights Templar a few weeks ago, a couple weeks back. The Templars, well, it is said that the Templar Grand Vizier cursed the king and said, "Your descendants will never sit on the throne." Well, Philip had 3 sons. When Philip the Fair died, Philip IV died, his sons got the throne, each one on one at a time, for a period of 18 years. And they all died young without any children. They averaged about 6 years apiece, and then the throne of France was vacant. The last king, the last son of Philip, had no heirs. The King of England, who is related to the King of France, said, "Okay, I'm the king of France too." The people of England picked someone who was closely related to the royal line and made him the king. And the King of England then went to war to get what he thought was his throne. This war was to last more than 100 years, and it was to be fought on and off again. 2 or 3 times during the war, there were 20-year periods of peace with no fighting. But the fighting went on. There were other issues involved, but mainly it was just, the only issue I'm concerned with here is that the King of England claimed the throne of France, and the French people did not want the English king to be their king. Now, the 100 Years' War was a big turning point in the history of warfare for several reasons. The big one was knights in armor. Up until this time, when armies clashed, very few knights would get killed. The armor would protect them. The bodies that were on the battlefield were most of the bodies of commoners, and their bodies would live in the field when the fighting was over. But as a result of the 100 Years' War, knights in armor got killed also. To protect themselves further, the knights put on heavier armor, and some knights even became deformed after wearing the armor for a few years. But the knights put on heavy armor, and the armor became so heavy that if a knight fell, it took at least 4 or 5 other men to pick him back up and get him on his feet again. And if a knight fell off his horse, it usually was the end, because if he didn't die in the fall, which most of the time he did, he'd suffocate inside that armor because he simply could not move. The armor became very heavy. What made the heavy armor necessary were 3 things: pikes, arrows, and gunpowder. Gunpowder came into widespread use, and obviously it was to change warfare forever and guarantee that the nobles would no longer have a big advantage over the commoners, because a common man with a gun could kill a lord. And if the armor did not protect you much against a powerful bullet. The pikemen. They learned that a pike is a type of long stick with a sharp point in the end. You can compare it to a spear. Oftentimes the pikes were pointed like this. To where if the pikeman didn't get you when he thrust outward, he would get you on the backward. He'd thrust out and then thrust back, and this would get you when you thrust back. But also the pikemen would line up shoulder to shoulder, like the old phalanx. And those European armies were beginning to realize that organization was the better part of winning a fight. They line up shoulder to shoulder and point their pikes straight ahead. And for these pikes, they could stop a knight in armor. If one pike didn't get them, another pikeman would. And your pike, now, as for your bows and arrows, the English in particular started using the long bow, 6 foot long. And needless to say, that thing could penetrate armor also. But in addition, they used the crossbow. The crossbow was so powerful that it had to be mechanically cocked with a lever. And it could be aimed like a gun. It would be pointed at a gun. And it actually had a kick to it, somewhat like a gun. It was so powerful that some popes actually tried to outlaw its use. Now, how many of you know what I'm talking about? Because a long bow and a crossbow, I'll say that when I was a kid, I used to make bows and arrows out of tree limbs. Cut a branch off a tree and try to make it. And my dad before me had done it himself. And a 6-foot bow can be a powerful bow if you get the right kind of wood. Of course, we didn't not have the right kind of wood. But those people learned what kind of wood would work. And you have to be careful that you don't get a grain going all the way across, what's called a cross grain, because if it has a cross grain, it's going to snap in two when you cock it. But the crossbow, again, very powerful weapon. It could shoot a very, very powerful bow shot. The long bow is a little bit less powerful, maybe a little bit less accurate, but it could be fired. I mean, some of these men could fire 10 arrows in the air and have the 10th one in the air before the first one came back down. I mean, they could shoot with rapidity, and they could, I mean, you get a few hundred longbowmen, and they could actually almost blot out the light from the sun with their arrows. A big hail of arrows that was difficult, if not impossible, to dodge. The foot soldier then was becoming more important because most of your bowmen were commoners, and most of your crossmen were commoners also, and all your pikemen were commoners. And most of your gunpowder men, the cannon operators, were common people also. So your common people were becoming more and more important in the battle. Now, we're not going to take 100 years to fight the war, but I do want to mention the Battle of Crécy. Both sides were eager for a fight, and both sides believed that they would easily win. The French knights went into battle with no planning, no formation. They galloped into battle, and they met with a big hail of arrows. While they were being hit by arrows, a sudden rainstorm came up, and those horses began to slip in the mud and fall and break their legs. And of course, you may know when a horse breaks its leg, even with modern day doctors and veterinarians we have today, when a horse breaks its leg, there's nothing you can do but destroy it. It would take several men to pick them up and fall, and so most of the knights who fell simply smothered in their army. So the battle wound up being an English victory, but it was not decisive. Now there was another similar battle, Battle of Agincourt. Again, the French knights galloped into battle, met by arrows, and rain came up. Both battles. Anyway, the English might have won. Here was the problem the French had. The French outnumbered the English 4-1. If you look on the map, even in those days, France was a bigger country, but the French lacked unity, they lacked patriotism. Half your French nobles were really for the English, did not have any love for their king or the country, and this gave the English a chance to win. Now, late in the war, we come to a king named Charles the Mad. Officially, he's called Charles VI. According to the story, now, Charles the Mad was on his way to fight the English one day, and some insane man touched him. I mean, I'm not going to try to explain what happened, but I'm just going to tell you what the sources tell us. And Charles himself became insane, and he began flailing out, and he struck and killed one of his favorite knights who was closest to him. Charles VI was to remain like this for 30 years, but during this period of time, he was in and out of insanity. At least once he went 2 years without any fit of insanity. Then he went insane again. He never fully recovered. They called in exorcists, they called in sorcerers, they even called in witches, they called in every means they knew to try to give his sanity back. He never quite became sane again. Well, late in his reign, he made out a will in which he willed his crown to the King of England. And for 20 years there was no fighting. Now, if any of you know anything about wills, the mental condition of the person making out the will often determines whether the will is going to be held valid or not. The French said that Charles was known to be insane, therefore any will he made up was not valid. All right, make long story short, Charles died. In the meantime, he had had a son named Charles VII. And if you look into more detail, Charles VII never knew for sure if he was really the son of Charles VI or not. Of course, he knew his mother. His mother was the queen, Charles VI's wife. But some people have suspected all down through the ages, I mean, from that day to this, that Charles VI's wife had an affair, and Charles VII really was born from an affair and not born from his father. But nevertheless, he got the title Charles VII. Charles VII was unsure whether he was king or not, so he was a very indecisive man. But when the French said they were going to give him the throne, the English started fighting again, and the English were winning. Charles VII was known to appear in public with patched clothes. You know, he looked like a pauper some of the time. He lacked leadership. He could not come to firm decisions. For all that, he still was an intelligent man. But basically, the English were winning. Now, here's this part of the story, folk, and I'm going to tell you in advance. I'm not going to try to explain what happened. I'm going to give it to you, you might say, in raw format, and let you decide for yourself what happened based on your worldview. Young woman in the village of Domremy, which is close to the border of France and Germany, but in the far edge of Charles's realm. Young girl, I call her woman, young girl, teenage girl named Joan of Arc, began hearing voices. The voices told her to go to the king and lead an army and defeat the English. Well, the voices, according to her, came from St. Catherine, St. Margaret, St. Michael. These are three saints we don't hear much of today, we've forgotten about, but saints that were very important to her then. One day, she went to the local nobleman named Sir Robert Beaumains. The only reason we remember Sir Robert is because of Joanne. She went to the local nobleman, Sir Robert, and said, hey, take me to the king. I want to field an army to defeat the English. He laughed her, and he and his entire court laughed her out of the court. When she got home, her father gave her a good whipping. She settled down for a while, but then she started hearing her voice again. Get up, go back to Sir Robert, and eventually he'll take you to the king. Now, I want to interrupt the story here to tell you, it was not unheard of for women to serve in the army. One of you, or once it was in maybe this guy, I did a paper on the role of women in the Crusades. Women had served, and some of them actually served with distinction. It was not unheard of also for a young teenage girl to go to a nobleman with her problems or with some suggestion of how things could be better. So it's probably not the least bit unusual when Sir Robert saw Joanne come into his court. This we know was done often. Nevertheless, Joanne went back, and here's a part of the story we never can quite figure out. Somehow, she got Sir Robert to take her seriously, and somehow she got Sir Robert to listen to her. Well, by this time, the word had gotten out all over France that there was this young peasant. The word also got out among the English, so both sides heard it. There was this young peasant girl who claimed that she could defeat the English, that God had appointed her and God had called her, she was going to defeat the English. So Sir Robert gave some of his best troops, and they traveled at night so they could avoid the English, and they hid away in the daytime. Now, if you were to visit eastern France today, you'll find a lot of people who will proudly tell you that my ancestors hid Joan of Arc away in the daytime. My ancestors kept Joanne of Arc. Yes, anyway, she went to the court of the king, where the king was staying. Nobody knew for sure, was she a saint or was she a witch or just what to make of her. But she got the respect of the French people right away when one of the guards who was guarding the king's castle made fun of her, and she said, "You better watch what you're saying, for your death is near." Within an hour, that guard was dead. Well, the king was going to try to make sport of her. The king, I mean, in some ways was an intelligent man. I've told you how indecisive he was, but he was an intelligent man. He called a lackey into an adjacent room and said to the lackey, "You're my size, you and me change clothes." So the lackey came out dressed in the king's clothes with a crown on his head and the royal robes. This time, I mean, the king was dressed up. And the king came out dressed in lackey clothes and carrying a tray and standing at the side of the wall with a tray. The whole court realized what had happened. Of course, yeah, we're gonna make a dunce out of this girl. So in walks Joan of Arc, having supposedly never seen the king before. She ignored the lackey who was sitting on a throne with the royal robes and a crown and the servants around him. She went right straight to the king, who was dressed in lackey clothes, and bowed down and did obeisance. The king was highly impressed, but also extremely surprised. Now, folk, what I told you just now is what the most educated people of Europe witnessed at the time and actually saw. Now, again, what's the explanation? There is one I'll give you in a few minutes, but anyway. Well, the king did not know what to make of this woman, but here's what qualified her to lead the army. All of a sudden, the king had, well, the city of Orleans was being besieged by the English. And the king's job, of course, was to try to raise the siege, but the problem was the king had no army until Joanne came along, and then all of a sudden volunteers started pouring into the king's army from all over the realm. And everybody knows to this day, and even the king knew, that the only reason he had this army was because of Joanne. What Joanne supplied was what the English didn't have: a spirit of patriotism, a zeal, an enthusiasm, a fire, a willingness to, hey, this France is worth dying for. I'm a Frenchman, and I'm French, and I'm proud of it. All of a sudden, the French people began to experience, I say, a pride of being French they had not had before, something the king himself had not been able to instill in them. The king had to, like I said, the king all of a sudden had an army that he knew was big enough to lift the siege of Orleans, but did he want to give it to this peasant girl? Well, he tried to, he farmed her out to one bishop to examine her, then they farmed her out to another bishop. All the bishops reported that she was a virgin. That was very important at the time. And then they would ask her questions, and some of the answers she gave, I mean, the questions they asked, answers she gave, will astound you that this woman was a woman of extreme intelligence, much more intelligence than the typical peasant girl would have. But she could give really, really good answers to the questions. Well, ultimately, the king realized that the only person in the realm who could make the decision to give her or not give her the army was he himself. None of his bishops could do it. None of his generals could decide. Ultimately, he had to decide. Well, guess what? He gave her the army. To this day, I've never read a historian who will fault him for it. He gave her command of the army. She went to Orleans. Under her command, lifted the siege of Orleans. Now, all told, she was destined to win 4 victories. And then, only then, was Charles able to have himself crowned. So he had himself crowned, and in his crown, of course, the archbishop was there to put the crown in his head, and of course, by one side, on the king's right, was his wife. On the king's left was Joanne. That was Joanne's big moment, high moment, and she later said that maybe she was full of pride. Her next move was to go to the king and say, "Your Majesty, I think we should invade Paris." King's his generals, "Oh no, we're not ready. We hope to take Paris later, but we're not ready to take on Paris yet." "Oh no, let's go, take Paris." Well, she was even able to tell the king what to do. So finally she got away and she went to Paris, but this time not with a big army. She was captured by the Burgundians. You know, the Burgundians were French. The Burgundians turned her over to the English, basically betrayed her. And the king showed no interest whatever in freeing her. The French tried her, found her guilty of witchcraft, and burned her at the stake. Now, you may wonder, why would the king not want to save her? Here's why. Joanne had a couple of problems. Problem number one, she was an extremely domineering female figure. Very, even to the point of telling the king's generals what to do and what not to do, even to the point of telling the king himself what to do. And the king felt like as long as she's around, I'll never be king, which was partly true. And by the way, this king, he wound up living to be an old man. He married, but then he had a mistress, and so many he had a mistress control him also. Basically, he was henpecked by some woman all his life. But that's jumping ahead of the story a little bit. But anyway, he had no interest in saving her. The English finally burned her at the stake as a witch, and the year was 1431. Well, 2 years later, her father died of a broken heart. The king, though, gave her family a title of nobility and exempted her from taxes for 300 years. So now, as a noble woman, Joanne's mother lived for another 20 years, lived to be an old woman. The king himself lived to be an old man. After 20 years, Joanne's mother appealed to the king, wrote a letter to the king, asking that Joanne's case be retried. Well, the only person who was high enough to retry, the only church who was high enough to retry the case was the Pope. So the king wrote a letter to the Pope asking that Joanne's case be retried. The problem was some of the bishops who had condemned Joanne were still alive. But what the Pope did was he exonerated Joanne of all the charges that were made by bishops and clerics who were deceased, but the ones who were still alive, those charges stood. If you know anything about the papacy, most popes are up in years and only last for an average of 5 years. That pope died shortly thereafter. A new pope came on the scene, but this time all the clerics who had condemned Joanne were dead also. So the king wrote a letter to the new pope, and the new pope acquitted Joanne of all charges and restored her to full fellowship in the church. And there Joanne was for several hundred years. Finally, after World War I, in the year 1920, when the Pope at that time felt like he needed to have some hero to unite Christendom again, to unite Europe, that Europe needed a hero, he made Joanne a saint. Her date is May 30th. She's now called by some Saint Joan of Arc. She went from witch to saint during a period of some 500 years. Now, I told you I'd give one possible explanation. There is a story that Charles VI had an illegitimate daughter that he did not want anybody to know about. So he took this daughter and put her at the far corners of his realm, and that Joanne of Arc was actually the daughter of Charles VI and the half-brother of Charles VII. This story is told, and the woman they burned was actually a real witch, and not the real Joan of Arc. That they came and rescued the Joan of Arc because they found out she really was ready at the end. This would explain, in part, maybe, why she was so concerned about France, because she actually was a daughter of one king and half-brother to another, and it might help explain that why she was, not that being of royal blood made her more intelligent, but that she actually was educated more so than the other young girls of her day, because of the fact that she was the king's daughter. The king saw to it that she was educated, and that made her appear more intelligent than the others. And that she actually wound up, instead of being burned at the stake, she actually married some nobleman and lived a good many years and had a few children. The person they burned at the stake, again, was just some imposter that they put in her place. This is the one story that has been told, which would explain why she could recognize her half-brother because she'd actually seen him several times before, which would explain why Sir Robert all of a sudden had to change of heart and took her to the king anyway, because she had a secret meeting with him where she told him, hey, I'm really the former king's daughter, and I'm really the king's half-brother, and he believed it. This gives some kind of a rational explanation of what went on. Otherwise, it's difficult to find another rational explanation as to what influenced Joanne. Now, how many of you have heard the story of Joan of Arc before? Okay, she makes news from time to time. I mean, at MSN once, about 5 or 6 months ago, featured an article on famous people who died young. And among them was, the first one they mentioned was Joan of Arc, who only lived 21 years. Another one was Elvis Presley, who only lived 41 years. And they named, so because you hear from time to time, folk, and yes, just recently, some famous person, mostly an entertainer, who dies unexpectedly and dies quite young. Those type of people have more problems than most of us can handle, more than they can handle. All right, anyway. When Joan of Arc passed off the scene, Charles VII spent a couple years doing little, then he caught fire. He learned how to pick his fights, so he picked the fight, had the best chance of winning. As he picked a fight, he'd get a noble duke on his side. He'd pick another fight against the weaker opposition. He learned how to pick them, and in some way he was a wise man. He'd get another duke on his side and won a battle. Within 7 years, he had the Duke of Burgundy. I mean, keep in mind, it was the Duke of Burgundy who turned Joan of Arc over to English. But in 7 years, he had the Duke of Burgundy and the Duke of Lorraine on his side. In those days, those were the two most powerful dukes in France. Once the king got the Duke of Burgundy and the Duke of Lorraine on his side, the English might as well have gone home. In 1453, the 100 Years' War ended. 21 years after Joan was burned at the stake, 1453 has been called the dividing line between modern history and medieval history because two things happened. Number one, the 100 Years' War ended, and number two, Constantinople was captured and the Byzantine Empire came to an end. Two things happened that year that marked the turning point in history. Again, the big contribution Joanne made was not that she was a military genius, not that she knew anything about strategy or planning. What the French people needed was what she supplied, a fire built under them. The pride of being French and a willingness that we're not going to be pushed around by these smaller English people. I mean, England was a smaller country. I misphrased that. But we're not going to be pushed around by a smaller country. We are going to set our own destiny and pick our own king. And this was what Joanne supplied, and it was all that the French needed to turn the tide and drive the English out. The power of the kings, now we talk about this with the Japanese, the power of the kings would wane back and forth. Sometimes kings were able to assert themselves, and sometimes the nobles were stronger. Eventually, the king became the strong man in the country, and the power of the nobles was weakened. Byzantine Empire. The Byzantine Empire had been irreparably damaged by the Fourth Crusade, and finally, a Turkish leader named Mehmet II. Mehmet II attacked Constantinople, and he captured Constantinople. The Emperor Constantine X appealed to Europe for help, but only a few people from Genoa came out. They were not enough. And the Muslims seemed like they're on their way to taking Europe. They didn't. In 1492, Ferdinand and Isabella drove them out of Spain, so that ended the threat from the west. But then in 1580, I mean, this happened in 1453 with Mehmet II. In 1580, the Muslim Empire, a Muslim army, got to Vienna, but Europeans got together in droves. The Polish, the Austrians, and several other European adventurers got together, and they drove them out. Islam made one last attempt. 100 years later, in 1680, the Muslims again came to Vienna, Austria, the capital of Austria. Again, the Europeans banded together. Austria was militarily weak folk. Austria seldom won any of its wars. But the Europeans banded together and drove the Muslims out of Vienna the second time. Then European technology left Islamic technology behind, and Europeans were able to go on and conquer almost every Muslim country, with a possible exception of Morocco. Just about every other Muslim country has been conquered by some European country at one time or another. All right. Your book mentions Italy and Germany again. I want to remind Italy and Germany were destined to remain disunited until 1870. Now, I've got one more. The church. The church was to suffer decline, partly as a result of the way they handled the Black Death. In the Roman times, when the plague came, the church people would stay and help the sick. When the Black Death came, the Black Death was a more fearsome plague and a more painful plague. But the popes had enjoyed control of Western Christendom. Now, we finally, though, had a king who was willing to stand up to the Pope. That king was, Philip the Fair. Philip of France. The Pope was Boniface VIII. Boniface VIII told King Philip what to do. King Philip refused and sent an army instead to capture Boniface. Boniface had to flee Rome, but he died of a broken heart mainly. He died very shortly afterward, a broken-hearted person. He expected that he was the all-powerful vicar of Christ, and here a king stood up to him. King Philip then moved the papacy to a French city of Avignon. And for 70 years, the popes operated from the city of Avignon. Well, finally, after 70 years away from Rome, there was a pope. By the way, this has been called the Babylonian captivity of the papacy, reminding you that the Jewish Babylonian captivity had lasted 70 years. So for 70 years, the popes were ruling from Avignon. All of the Avignon popes were French, and most of the church officials were French. So basically, the French had control of the papacy and appeared to have control of the church. Well, finally, the church, some people in the church got together and elected a pope in Rome. So now the church had two popes, each of them claiming to be the true pope, because the one in Avignon would not retire. Well, some people got together and said, high up people, they got together and said, well, this is not good. We can't have two popes. There's only one pope. So let's elect a pope. So they elected a pope. And the other two would not retire. So you now had two popes in Rome and one at Avignon. And each of them hurling curses and anathemas at each other and excommunicating each other. This has been called the Papal Schism. Sometimes called the Great Schism, the Papal Schism. We had three popes. Well, this had become a big scandal in Europe, and Europe felt like it somehow needed a united church again. So the Holy Roman Emperor told one of the popes, said, if you'll call an ecumenical council, we promise, all of us, I'll talk to the other princes of Europe, all the monarchs and nobles, we promise whomever you elect. Now, folks, this is very important. The church was to pick its own pope, not the emperor. Again, that's separation of church and state that Europe still has to this day. Anyway, the council was called, and all of Europe's princes promised that we will abide by the decision of the council. The council elected a new pope, Martin V, and when Martin V was elected, one of the popes was deposed. The other two retired, because they saw they had no support. So finally, Europe had only one pope again. The Great Schism had come to an end, but it had done irreparable damage to the church and to the papacy. Within 100 years, a man named Martin Luther was going to be born, and he was going to do a lot to divide the church, but the church had already suffered a lot of irreparable harm as a result of the Great Schism. As for the new pope, he made cardinals of the other three popes who had resigned. Now, this event made news just 3 years ago, folk, because in the year 2013, we had a pope to resign. Most of you should open up to him. Pope Benedict XVI resigned. It said it was the first time a pope had resigned since the Great Schism in the 1300s, and it had been more than 600 years since a pope had resigned. Yeah, they checked the records, and yes, they had two popes resign then. One of them resigned after the other. But 600 years later, another pope was resigned. Remember, yes, during the Great Schism, the pope had resigned. But from that day till 2013, all the popes who had been in office had died in office without resigning.